What are some nuanced differences between communism and fascism? I'm Marco Perri. Welcome to the Perri platform. So I came across a video clip from Slavoj Zizek. Maybe I'm saying his name wrong, but I think that's right. And he's a famous intellectual, and he was making observations about some subtle differences between fascism and communism. I found some of these things to be strikingly resembling to today's current political climate. So I thought that would be very interesting to discuss here. So obviously there are some major differences between the ideologies, but he didn't really talk about those. It was more about the nuanced changes between the two. So right off the bat, just in case you're unaware, fascism and communism represent the polar ideologies on both sides of the extreme. The extreme left wing gravitates towards communism, and the extreme right gravitates towards fascism. It's also kind of funny to me how the poles have shifted. This is truly where the extremes are. The extreme left and the extreme right. Nowadays you can be labeled extreme and not actually fit those silos. So what do you consider these? Ultra extreme? That seems to be the most appropriate headlines now in today's world. If I had to summarize the ideology of communism very swiftly, I would say it boils down to essentially trying to establish a sense of equality within your nation. You are dismayed by the fact that there is injustice and inequality, maybe from economic reasons and whatnot, and you want to change that playing field. You want to make it fair for everybody. An observation that I have, even just saying that, is that, wow, the idea of communism, it does sound right. To an intellectual who might be trying to think very compassionately, it sounds like a valid goal to strive for. Make everybody equal. That's amazing. And that's one of the things about communism, and Marxism for that matter, that give it a certain charm and allows the ideology to still exist today. You don't see the same happening with fascism because communism is wrapped in a perceived veil of compassion. They're doing these things for society, for everybody, but what we do find when we look at history is that the price is very high, and it's arguable that it's not compatible with human nature. Typically what happens with this supposed search for equality is that you might get some sense of it, but it's not going to be everyone equally well off. It's everyone equally poor, everyone equally on the brink of death. Now fascism, I would say, is more so a heavy nationalist type of ideology. You want to strengthen your country as much as you can, economically, military-wise, and you do that by establishing very rigid systems in the society. You make it very clear what your aims are, and you have one supreme leader who is authoritarian. That's the same in communism and fascism, and he calls the shots, and he does it by strengthening everyone around a common goal. Typically, it is expansion and military might. Of course, there have been some deviations with these ideologies and where they manifest in parts of the world, but generally, those are the building blocks for them. Now, back to Zizek and what he said. So the first difference he found between the ideologies was clapping. So in Stalinism, which occurred in Russia under Stalin himself, people would clap for the leader after he gave a speech. Under Stalin, he would clap as well. Under some of the fascist regimes, like in Germany, with Nazism, the leaders would receive the ovation, but they wouldn't join along in the clapping. He found this to be very interesting. He said it symbolizes the deep roots of the ideologies. In communism, it's not about the leader supposedly, it's about the ideas. We're all comrades in society. So when you clap for him, you clap for the ideas, not particularly Stalin. So he's going to join in that. In fascism, you are clapping for the leader, and he's going to take that and receive it very well. In Stalinism, it all serves the cause. My question, though, when you mentioned this was really, though, I think on the surface level, it is just for the cause. But when you think about it, it's not all equal. It's part of a facade that they want to give you in these communist regimes. And I find that to be more dastardly than even just admitting to people that no, there is a hierarchy. There still exists the hierarchy in communism. Why aren't Stalin himself and his advisors partaking in mowing the fields? Why aren't they the ones being killed by the famine? It never happens to them. The hierarchy exists still, but the powers have shifted to the government now. They have labeled the enemy. It might be the rich farmers, or it could be the elite and whatnot, and they've effectively wiped them out. So what happens is not clearly equality for everyone. The government becomes the ruling supreme now, and if you're a member of that, you are inherently the elite. Stalin might clap along with you and try to force the idea of camaraderie, that they're all the same, but it's really not. When it comes down to who bears the brunt of the downside of these communist regimes, it is never going to be Stalin and his close circle. Not the 1%, you could say. It's going to be the commoners, the peasants who believe they've achieved equality, but they really have not. The idea of a facade is very prevalent in both the ideologies, but based on this clapping example, it seems to me that you can make the case that in communism, it is far more important to maintain the facade because of what you've directly promised, which is equality. Once you start to falter on that, the very essence of your mission, the people could rise up against you. In fascism, it's a little bit different. They don't promise you equality. It's more so about strengthening and expansion, which is a little bit more of a hazy goal. It can happen slowly, it can happen fast, it might not happen at all. You still need to play the facade game to get people rallied around you. But in communism, it changes very differently because everyone is impacted directly from that immediately. So the second nuance that Zizek points out is one that's very interesting to me. So apparently in the gulags, which were the labor camps in Russia, inmates would have to sign a birthday card when it was Stalin's birthday. They would have to say something along the lines of, "Congratulations, comrade, on your success and your mission going well." Those were the inmates in the gulags. It's the idea of treating somebody as if they still have a role to play, essentially. Zizek makes the claim that you cannot imagine this happening in a Nazi concentration camp. Passing around a birthday card for Hitler, asking the inmates to sign that, it wouldn't be a thing, and he's correct with that, actually. It would never happen. So why is that? It goes back to the role left to play argument. So in fascism, Nazism in particular, the divide that they created was between the German citizens and the Jewish people, and you would be guilty inherently, and there was no need for you left in that society. They'll try to get rid of you by any means possible, and we saw what happened with those camps. In communism, it's a little bit different. I don't think it's entirely different, but there is a little bit of a distinction to be made here. You may be trash. You may be in this camp for a reason, but you can still uplift society. We can still stand on your shoulders and make some good out of you. You're doing some work, presumably, in these camps, some labor, that will help us all. That's the level of state brainwashing and groupthink that's prevalent in that system there. It goes back to how the ideologies divided their groups, the contesting groups that they're trying to manipulate. In Germany, it was the Germans and the Jews, or the Aryan race. And now in Russia, under Stalin, it was different. It wasn't so much about race, it was against the working class. The average poor citizen versus the rich, that's what it was about. Now in Russia, it wasn't only the rich who were in the gulags, but if in a system like that, in a prison detention camp, you can have people signing a birthday card for the man who orchestrated the regime that put you in there, telling you to say congratulations to him, and you actually do it. That's how you know that the system has brainwashed the masses to a degree that rarely happens. All in the supposed name of equality. It's with the mission. As I said before, it's a compassionate goal. Something the average person can get behind. If you're in the camp, yeah, I'm working for equality. I'm trying to make this country better for everyone. Maybe you can find some sense of purpose in that. But in the fascist system, it's not the same. You might be just dying in there because, well, they don't like you, first of all. And even if you were contributing to the regime, you're doing it for what? For war reasons, for expansion? It's not the same. Now, although that is an interesting difference, the fundamental issue here is who determines what's good in the Stalinist regime. Obviously, the answer is the authoritarian who runs the system. They have shown numerous times that what's good, what they project to you being good, may not actually be so good. One of the many injustices that came out of this desire to equalize the playing field actually occurred with the rich farmers I mentioned in the past. Stalin was able to stir the lower class to dislike the successful peasant farmers. He said it was unfair had they created wealth for themselves. They're benefiting off the land that we should all be entitled to. That got people angry. The regime was able to seize the farms, and if the wealthy farmers on there resisted, they were slain. All of their assets were taken from them. That's one thing about communism too. There is no individual rights to anything. It's a communist group ideology through and through. So, the land was taken from those farmers, and a lot of them were killed trying to resist. Then the government gave it to the unskilled workers. It's equality. We're giving all of you access to the assets that you didn't have before. Now, work on it. It was government mandated land, which is funny too. That's not the same thing as society owning it. The government is an authoritarian regime. It was theirs. And they let you work on it. So the fundamental fact was that the skills of the peasants who were farming it successfully was not the same as the average Joe who just wanted a piece. The new wave of farmers weren't able to successfully cultivate it, and what happened? There were massive famines that killed millions of people across the country. And that's what I mean by the idea of what's good not actually being good sometimes. It's at the whim of the ruler. And this leads me to my next point. There actually is a lot of similarity between the two ideologies. In communism, it's hidden sometimes, but in fascism, it's more open. The truth is they both function off a divide, dividing the populace and group identity. Nazism divided by Germans against the Jews. In communism, it was divided from the rich against the poor, but what they really spoke about was it being about everyone. It was good for everybody. It was equality for all. It really wasn't everyone, though. You need to fracture your populace into distinct groups to motivate change. You have to get people angry at the opposition. You need an enemy for people to be riled up. That's what the two ideologies are good at doing. Stalin was able to stir the lower class against the rich, and Hitler did it against the Jews. It's very similar in terms of where the ideologies originate from. Of course, in terms of how they manifest after that, there is difference and the goals behind them. But at the core, they come from the same place. The Germans arrived at this idea from a sense of unfairness from the way they were left after the First World War. They needed someone to blame because their situation was so perplexing. They needed an easy answer. For the Russians, it was very similar. The poor were angry. They were supposedly being taken advantage of it and needed an answer for that. Why am I so poor? It's because the rich are stealing from you. They're making your life very difficult. Once you have that divide, it's easy to manipulate them. In Nazism, people also performed tasks under the guise of what was good for society, all coming from the authoritarian leader combined with state propaganda. It made you believe that what you were doing was justified. When you lose the ability to think for yourself and speak freely, these are the realities that can await. It's also very interesting to note that when people think about the Nazis and they think about themselves, it's very common to think, I would never do that. But one thing to take into account is that those are people. You are a person too. So why can they do it but you can't? The answer really comes down to that it's wrong to think like that. If you grew up in Nazi Germany, the societal pressures, the propaganda, the way you were brought up, the education, everything, it plays a role into what you end up believing. That's why it's so important to uphold these freedoms that we have today. A government agenda being pushed down upon you leads to you inherently internalizing that. When I see people today being happy that the government is trying to mandate certain things like banning hate speech or forcing you to use certain words, that's what I think about. Government control, and right now you can say it's mundane. It's not really a big issue, but this is only the tip of the iceberg. Where does it go from here once you open that door? That's the question. When people under the Soviet regime were killing successful farmers in the name of equality, I'm sure that some of them had reservations. I'm also sure that some Nazis had some form of human remorse, at least in the beginning, before it became a systemic duty. The difference between having those feelings and acting on them is the state conditions, where you live, and what the consequences are. The government would likely kill you for deviation in those authoritarian regimes, and at the very least you would be handed down harsh consequences. Maybe you get your hand cut off or something, because disrupting the collective mind is dangerous to their very existence. I wonder if we've strayed too close to this line of thinking today. Deviance and political correctness are arguably a minor manifestation of that ideology. Maybe not so minor either. You won't be killed, but you may be cancelled. You may be shunned by society. You may lose your job. There's a lot of things that come with not having the correct viewpoint. Putting up barriers to logical opposition runs the risk of you spiraling out of control with nobody to keep you in check. It also stops you at the individual level from saying something when things have gone too far. Now, some may ask, why is this happening if we know it's bad? The fact is, we don't really know it's bad, especially in terms of society as a whole. There's a lack of historical knowledge, and that's not a fault of these students per se. People generally know about Nazis. They know a little bit less about Russia and Stalin, a little bit less about Japan, a little bit less about Italy, less about Mao and China, almost nothing about Pol Pot and Cambodia, and the list goes on and on. There are some frightening lessons to be learned about what happened in the past, and a shocking repeat of some of those errors are coming up today, but people are simply not aware of it. The curriculum does not dive into that at the level that we should. I really enjoyed this clip and conversation from Zizek because he attempted to outline nuances between the two polar ideologies, but I was really left with the sense that they aren't so different after all. Of course, the way they manifest is, but they play the same game. Different outcomes, but the same game, and very similar motivations stemming from these senses of injustice being done upon them and trying to extract some form of justice. Communism would like the equalization of resources and whatnot, while fascism would like to muster a strong single country force, but what motivates these ideologies at the core is a sense of unfairness. Germany was dismayed by the unfortunate set of circumstances left to them following World War I. Stalinism stemmed from people's distaste for the working class and the rich. In times of high moral panic and trying to find an answer to a complicated problem, it's easy to gravitate towards easy answers from a strong leader. You can feel justified in committing wrongdoings in pursuit of your higher aim. Equality, or fairness, or redemption, the price is never too high until it gets too high. Killing farmers and producing the death of millions of people becomes justified in an attempt to bring about heaven on earth. To correct some wrong by administering more wrongs is just asinine from a conceptual standpoint. What we have in terms of Western liberal democracy and capitalism, it may not be the best possible way to organize human society, and I'm open to that. It has its faults, but I'm convinced it's the best bad system that we have. I would really like to hear a better idea, but for millions of years, this has been the pinnacle of human achievement. It's the best that we've been able to summon, and it is pretty great. Of course, changes to how we function within the system are needed. You can look at the rise of automation for one catalyst or an example of that, but we walk a thin line between chaos and stability. It seems like core tenets that we uphold, such as freedom of speech, individual rights, and voting, have kept us from straying too far off the path. I wouldn't be swift to disregard these pillars of society because we do that at our own dismay. This may be a lesson that society has to learn right now, given our current age of political correctness and polarization and anger. The split that allowed Nazism and Stalinism to arise is happening right now. There are splits everywhere. Left versus right, race versus race, gender versus gender. This is something to be very careful about, especially when some of these ideologies are still festering today in very powerful places like China. If you think that your holy wrath and your justified anger can't be used against you to create an even bigger evil, you're wrong. So that brings me to the end of today's conversation. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to share and leave a review. That helps me out in the rankings, and you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Perri Platform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.